It's now my great pleasure to introduce my good friend and former LSC board chair, Doug Eakley. Doug was appointed to the LSC board by President Bill Clinton in 1993 and went on to serve as chair until 2003. Following his leadership at LSC, he stayed closely involved in the legal aid community. He currently serving as chair of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice and trustee of Legal Services of New Jersey. When I became chair, I immediately got in touch with Doug, and he not only gave me invaluable advice, but he also served on our presidential search committee that resulted in the selection of Jim Sandman, LSC's outstanding president for many years. A former Rhodes Scholar, a graduate of Yale, he served as first Assistant Attorney General of New Jersey, went on to become a partner at Lowenstein Sandler. He now teaches at Rutgers Law School. It's wonderful to see you, Doug. Thank you for being here with us today. Doug Eakley.
Is this on? Phew. So it is wonderful to be here. John, thank you for that introduction. Just one confession. 53 years ago, Hillary Rodham and I were two of, I think, just 4 students in the then Yale New Haven neighborhood law offices, a program founded by Gene and Edgar Kahn and funded by the Ford Foundation, really as a pilot/model for what has become the Legal Services Corporation. And Hillary, I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be with you again and to see you and to at least draw out a little bit of conversation about the years that have passed.
Well, Doug, thanks so much for everything you've done for the corporation. And I remember those early days in the New Haven Legal Services office because that really, in many ways, was the model for what came after. And it was an incredible experience. And here we are all these years later, still talking about legal services.
So, not quite an origin story, but starting with your unrelenting commitment, indeed dedication to social justice, which has been an inspiration for so many of us, including yours truly. Can you tell us a little bit about where the sources of that social justice commitment came from and how they guided your career throughout your career?
Well, I think I was very lucky to have 2 big influences when I was, a little girl growing up. One, my family, and particularly my mother, who had a very strong sense of trying to figure out how to do more to help people who were left out and left behind, because she'd had a childhood where that was basically the story of her growing up. And I took a lot of lessons from that, and also my public school teachers, the youth minister in my church. So it was both inside and outside of my family. But the message was always the same, that, there's work to be done, and you have to do your part to try to make things better for people. And I was, very active in all kinds of programs when I was in high school, both through my school and through my church, that were aimed at providing support for migrant families who used to come on their journey up from Mexico to pick the crops around the suburb that I grew up in outside of Chicago. And certainly when I was at in college and law school, the same sort of opportunities presented themselves. But I think the direct line from what I did as a law student to my involvement in Legal Services, certainly goes from that office in New Haven. And then when I was in Arkansas teaching at the University of Arkansas Law School, I started the first legal aid clinic there. I started a prison project to provide legal assistance to prisoners, and then worked to make sure that we were included and involved in the newly evolving legal services movement and eventually the corporation.
So I want to get back to that in a second. But I also want to ask you about your lifetime commitment to children and children's rights, because the first summer after you were after your first year in law school, you worked for Marian Wright Edelman's new program, the Children's Defense Fund, and then you came back to Yale, and Legal Services was part of that. But what was she like, and what was that experience like, and how did you manage to carry that commitment through as a thread to the social justice commitment?
Well, as I mentioned, my mother had a really tough life and was basically out on her own by the age of 13, supporting herself as a full-time babysitter in somebody's home who turned out to be sympathetic enough to let her actually go to high school, which was her great goal, which was to try to get an education. And the more I learned about her life as I got older, as a teenager, and realized how difficult it was if you had, family issues, which she had, if you had, difficulties continuing your education. And so I began really doing a lot of reading and thinking about early childhood development and what kinds of stresses impacted kids' development and what could be done to try to ameliorate that. And so when I got to Yale Law School, literally about the first day, I was there, remember, Doug, we had something called a bulletin board. I'm not sure all of you may not know what that is, but there was a bulletin board, and on the bulletin board, there was a notice that Marian Wright Edelman was coming. She had graduated from Yale Law School, and I had read about her. She was an African-American woman, came from Bennettsville, South Carolina, went to Spelman College, went to Yale Law School, then went and joined Dr. King's efforts in the South, was stationed in Mississippi, and became, the first black woman to be acknowledged as having passed the Mississippi bar. She was working on the Poor People's Campaign when Dr. King was assassinated. And so she was forming this new group called the Children's Defense Fund based on her own experience growing up, but also her experience in Mississippi, where she worked in some of the very earliest Head Start programs and saw, what a difference institutional support could make for kids. And so I went to hear her speak at Yale, and I was just so impressed. I went up to her afterwards, and I said, I'm a first-year Yale Law School student. I'd like to work for you this summer. And she said, I'd love to have you, but I can't pay you. And I said, well, that's a problem because I have to pay my way through Yale. And she said, well, if you can figure out how to get payment for yourself, I'd be happy to have you. So I was lucky enough to get a Law Students Civil Rights Research Council grant to work for Marian in that summer of 1970. And we worked on two big issues. One, migrant children. It was 1970, 10 years after a very historic television program called Harvest of Shame that Edward R. Murrow broadcast, a documentary about the condition of migrant workers in the United States. And because I'd had my experience as a very young teenager babysitting migrant children while their parents worked in the fields, when I was growing up, I had a real reaction to that when I saw it. And then 10 years later, then Senator Mondale, later Vice President Mondale, was holding hearings to see what had happened or not since the horrors of shame. And so, I was working with Marion and other, young law students on that effort. And then the other thing we did was to go out into the field to gather up information to make the case that there were literally millions of children in America with different forms of disability who were not in school. Because in those days, you did not have to take a child at a public school with a disability. And the people running this, Marion included, had young lawyers and other graduate students going out and literally knocking on doors, which I did in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I went door to door. In those days, people would actually open their door, and you could actually talk to them. And I would say, do you have children in your family who are not in school? And it was shocking. I would be invited into houses where I would see a girl sitting in a wheelchair, or I would see a little blind boy, or I would see a child with cerebral palsy. They were not in school because no school would take them. So that effort, which we all then pooled our findings, became the basis for, creating the legislation, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to compel the education of all of our children.
And just to continue that a little bit, you continued with the Children's Defense Fund, later went on the board, became board chair. Just one of your parallel paths of seeking social justice.
Well, it really was, my passion. I went back to Yale, and I thought I needed to learn more about how children developed so that we could figure out how better the law could be used to help support children's development. The first academic article I ever wrote was called Children Under the Law, and it was published in the Harvard Education Review. And I took an extra year at the Yale Child Study Center and the Yale New Haven Hospital. Again, it would have been 1970, 1971, because there was a new concept which had never been recognized in either the law or the medicine or the medical field to the extent that it needed to be, and that was child abuse. And two physicians in Denver wrote a very impactful study about following children who had unusual injuries and concluding that those children had been injured by someone in the home, and trying then to figure out medically, legally, psychologically, what do we do to support those children and their families. And I started making rounds with medical students, residents, interns at the hospital, because I was supposed to be providing kind of the legal perspective as they were, dealing with suspicious cases. That year that I spent, which was not actually taking law courses, but studying at the Yale Child Study Center and working at the hospital, became an incredibly important piece of the puzzle for me about what we needed to be thinking through as to how to help protect children and support children, but also understand their families and what could be done to support them that wasn't being done. And so after I graduated, I went to work full-time for the Children's Defense Fund under Marion. And then I stayed until I was called by John Doerr, you remember. John Doerr asked if I wanted to come to work on the impeachment inquiry staff investigating President Nixon. So you can't make my life up. I moved to Washington to do that.
So I don't hate to go back to the autumn of 1970, but you also joined Yale New Haven Legal Services that fall. What was that experience like, and what did you take away from it?
It was it was the first legal professional experience that I had any personal involvement in. So I was assigned, there was a young lawyer his name was Penn Rodine, and I was assigned to him to work on a case, and the case was about a foster child, a young black foster child who had been taken in. Her foster mother was an older black woman, and this young girl had been with the foster mother for quite some time, and the foster mother wanted to adopt her. And the social services agency in Connecticut refused her request, really on two grounds. One, that she was older and not in perfect health. Nothing about her nurturing and parenting of the little girl, but only about the sort of cutoff point and the idea that she might not be around long enough to see the child to adulthood. Then the other was there was a list, and the list was of people waiting for adoption. And so Penn Rodine decided to challenge the arbitrary nature of the social service agency's decision, and I was his, really his second chair person, and it went all the way to the Connecticut Supreme Court. And although we weren't successful in the case itself, it did provoke changes in the law based on what we argued were the best interests of the child. And this child had bonded with her foster mother. The foster mother was a loving, nurturing, caring woman. The child was flourishing, and they were making decisions not on assessing how that child had really been taken in and developed so well under the supervision of the foster mother, but these other in my view, arbitrary considerations. So that was a really important experience for me, seeing firsthand the difficulty of making the case, but laying the groundwork for getting changes made eventually that looked more to the best interest of the child and not bureaucratic guidelines.
So in 1976, Jimmy Carter is elected President of the United States. Meanwhile, post John Doerr, you had moved to Arkansas. You joined the faculty of the University of Arkansas. You founded the Arkansas Advocates for Children, as well as what became the Ozarks Legal Services program. And then somehow you asked President Carter to put you on a board, or nominate you for a board.
I didn't ask him, but he did put me on a board. But it might have been because I actually worked in his campaign. There is a connection that I think is understandable. I had worked, both Bill and I, because as you well know, I met Bill at Yale when he came back from being a Rhodes Scholar with you, and you both, came to the law school. I met him and then moved to Arkansas and taught at the law school and started the, legal services program. But I started the legal services program, but I had no idea when I did how challenged I would be by the local court. So I would, in the very beginning of this legal aid clinic, I would take, I would have students, we'd work on their preparation, interviewing the client, preparing the papers, and then, I would send them to court as I had been sent to court when I was at, Yale New Haven to do very, kind of functionary things, but nevertheless to get that experience. And so my students would come back and they would say, I couldn't file whatever it was, the divorce petition, the motion to, the case to prevent eviction, whatever it might be. And I'd say, why not? And they would say, because we were told that our clients don't qualify. They're not poor enough. So I'd only been living in Arkansas for like 3 weeks, and I had gone to one bar association gathering right before the law school started classes. And one of the law faculty was taking me around and introducing me to the people there. And he introduced me to a very tall, imposing-looking man who was the chancellor in the Chancery Court in the county where the law school was, Washington County, Arkansas. And he introduced me to this very formidable gentleman and told him that I was the new lady law professor and that I was going to start a legal aid clinic. And this man looked down at me and he goes, "Well, I don't have much use for that," and walked away. So that was the judge I had to go see. So I went in to see, and you're not going to believe this, I went in to see Judge Butt. And I said, "You know, Your Honor, I'm sending students to represent these poor clients, and your clerk is not, you know, accepting any of our papers at all. I don't understand." And he pulled down a dusty old law book, and he flipped it open, and he goes, "It says right here, 1877 statute. No one is entitled to free legal assistance unless they are worth no more than $10 and the clothes on their back." I said, "Well, Judge, it's not 1877 anymore. You know, most of our clients, they own an old car because they have to get back and forth to work. A lot of them work in the, you know, the chicken houses and the chicken manufacturing plants or the, you know, trucking plants, or, you know, these are hardworking people. They just don't have any money, but they have more money than $10 and the clothes on their back." And he said, "Well, I'm just following the statute." I said, "Okay, then we're going to have to change the statute." So So I worked with the Arkansas Bar Association, which was incredibly sympathetic and very helpful, and we changed the statute so that then we could actually represent clients in court.
So getting back to President Carter and the Legal Services Corporation, I think you were 30 at the time that you were nominated by the President and confirmed by the United States Senate. The very next year, the board of directors of the Legal Services Corporation, including the representatives nominated by President Ford, elected you board chair. And you served as board chair for the next 3 truly epical, historic years for the Legal Services Corporation. What was it like becoming board chair, and what was confronting you? And then we'll get to what you accomplished and what makes you proud.
Well, I was delighted when President Carter nominated me to be on the Legal Services Corporation board. And I was first a recess appointment, and then I was formally nominated, confirmed by the Senate, and joined an extraordinary board. Because as you say, some of the board members had been appointed by President Ford, and some were new appointees like me by President Carter. But it was a very collegial, committed board. And, you know, it's almost painful to remember how, yeah, maybe one was a Republican appointed by a Republican, another was a Democrat appointed by a Democrat, or one was, you know, no affiliation, but a, you know, very knowledgeable person. None of that mattered. Everybody worked together. And, you know, I was deeply honored when I was, you know, named, when they selected me, they elected me to be the chair, and we embarked on a program of expansion that was fully supported by all of the board members. The first president of the Legal Services Corporation, Tom Ehrlich, who got it going and started, who had been on the board, as well as the executive president, was succeeded by Dan Bradley, who had been an active legal services lawyer in Atlanta for quite some time. And everybody was pulling in the same direction. Nobody was, you know, subversive or going behind our backs or, you know, calling up members of Congress who weren't enthusiastic about our work. So the result of that kind of cooperative effort is that in 3 years, we tripled the funding. We went from $100 million to $300 million, and we began to lay out the system of, offices across the country. We had numerous hearings around the country where we had legal services lawyers, bar members, public officials, clients, both former and current, come and testify. And we took all of that very seriously, and we tried to accommodate, the various challenges in different parts of the country, and also straddle the lines, when you had state legislators and governors who were opposed to legal services, how we protected our offices there. It was an exciting and purposeful and impactful experience, and I was very proud about the way everybody worked together. And I think we laid a very strong foundation, and of course, we needed that because of everything that came after.
So, the $321 million that was appropriated in FY 1981 is still the watershed federal funding for legal services adjusted for current dollars, but an amazing effort. And it was coupled with a strategy called minimum access. And that was, I think, politically very astute, although there were rip currents going in an opposite direction. But could you talk a little bit about minimum access and why that was important to your board?
Well, obviously, we had to convince members of Congress as we went that increasing the budget by more than triple would benefit them. And that meant we needed, quote, minimum access. We needed to have legitimate accessibility to legal representation within easy distance, if you will, across the country. If we had just located all of our offices in big cities, we would never have survived. We had to be really conscious that there needed to be offices, and a lot of our offices basically were circuit riders. And that was the other thing we would tell members of Congress, say, well, maybe the office will be in Spokane, but the lawyers will have, satellite offices, and the lawyers will go to senior centers and community centers and church basements, wherever they can go, so that we're not going to just be in one place. And I can only say that it was such a movement. It wasn't just an institution. It was really filled with people who were so devoted to providing legal representation that all made sense. And so minimum access was a promise, that we felt we both needed to make, but also wanted to make, so that people wouldn't be left out or left behind.
Yeah. So the board under your leadership also took steps to enhance the quality and impact of the representation the now federally funded legal services lawyers were delivering. And you created really what is still, although it went through several permutations, a national delivery model with national and state support centers, training centers, research capacity, and the like, and seemed to put it all together in a very short period of time.
Well, these were really intense months, and like you say, it was basically a 3-year window that we had. I give the late Dan Bradley enormous credit. He was such a passionate believer in legal services, and we were on the board, but he was there day to day implementing everything that we were trying to accomplish. And the staff itself was so dedicated. And I'm really convinced that because we had smart, dedicated people who understood that doing the work was the most important part of their job, but making sure people knew they were doing the work, so that you built a political support system for legal services was also a big part of the job. So, we had offices that were, always reaching out to elected officials, particularly in parts of the country where, legal services wasn't as popular as we wished it were. And oftentimes they were, I don't want to say they were converting everybody, because it turned out that wasn't the case, but they were certainly convincing a lot of people that providing legal services was the right thing to do, but it was also the politically smart thing to do as well. So, And then, of course, 1981 came, so that became a real fight for survival that has lasted for a long time.
So just one shout out about that staff. Bucky Askew was the regional director at the time, then became a member of the Clinton board for all 8 years, and Bucky is with us today.
Is he really? Where is Bucky? Oh my gosh! Hello! Oh my gosh! Well, there is one of the people that made all that happen, and it's wonderful that he's here. Thank you.
So, you mentioned 1981, but I'd rather jump forward 35 years. It's also the the politic thing to do, perhaps. But so, after serving as First Lady of the United States, Secretary of the United States Senator from New York, then Secretary of State. You run for president in 2016, two of the most difficult years of your life, you subsequently write. You win the popular vote. 60 million people voted for you.
Nearly 65 million. 65,853,000. I am grateful to each and every one of them, honestly.
And I hope I didn't get this wrong, but you only lost the Electoral College by 3 votes for a third-party candidate.
Well, I lost the Electoral College by 77,000 votes in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And yeah, it was mostly third-party votes siphoning off. Remember that? Remember that it was third-party votes.
And
yes, it still is a relevant factoid. So, yeah, that's what happened.
So, in your book, after the election called What Happened, you talk about the importance of what you called radical empathy. Could you explain to us a bit unpack that concept and describe its significance as you see it in this fractured American society / polity?
Well, honestly, I think we are in very short supply of empathy right now, and there's a great need for people to see each other as on this journey we're all moving forward through life on together, and to try to put ourselves in each other's shoes insofar as possible. Because when, particularly political leaders, but it can be any kind of leader, sort of vies for power, obtains power, holds on to power by finger-pointing and scapegoating and undermining other people or groups of people, kinds of people, if you will, and you end up with the sort of disunity, the actual divisiveness that we are afflicted with today. It's a hard road back from that, but I think we have to do a better job of trying to practice that kind of empathy. And I think it's something that you all do every day by trying to present the stories and the rights of your clients in a way that people can understand and empathize with. And we need that not just in the law, but in politics. And I think we're about to run out of time.
We are. Just please join me in giving a great round of applause to Secretary Clinton for her presence here.